Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to Production Pulse, Industry Week's regular live stream show where we discuss news in the manufacturing world. And today we're doing a slightly different format. I've invited a few of our editors on to talk about things they've written recently and share a bit of an editor's roundtable to share some news, especially in the automotive space. Laura Poutre covers the leadership and automotive issues for Industry Week, and Geert de Lombard is our editor at large, who actually works across several brands within Endeavor Business Media, including Industry Week, and handles a lot of the financial news. And they've both been writing a lot about automotive recently. And Laura, let's start with you because you've been writing a lot about changes in the UAW with new leadership and a new direction from them. Can you tell us a little bit about just what's been going on with the nation's largest automotive union and what it could mean going forward?
Yeah, sure. The union elections took place over last year, and with all the recounting and deliberation, the votes finally came in. This month, everything was finalized. But it's a historic election in a couple of ways. One is for the first time in 70 years, the party. The Administrative Caucus Party did not win the election. An upstart party called Members United won, and a big reason for that was because, or part of the reason was because members they shifted from the union had to shift from from delegates to one party, one vote, one person, one vote. And this was because of a court-appointed monitor who decided after a union corruption scandal that instead of having delegates, that each member of the UAW, its 370,000 members, would get a vote. So that's what happened, and it was a close race. And the president is now Shawn Fain. He's from Members United, and his whole slate of candidates also won. So now that this new party has a majority.
So let's hear we have a brief clip from Shawn from his acceptance speech, and the tone is kind of interesting here. Let's hear what Shawn has to say.
Now, we're here to come together to ready ourselves for the war against our one and only true enemy, multi-billion-dollar corporations and employers that refuse to give.
Right. Well, YouTube problems aside, what Shawn was getting at was that the war against our one and only true enemy, multinational corporations that won't give our members their fair share. I mean, that's a far cry from a few years ago when Ron Gettelfinger was doing everything he could to keep in 2009, when Ron Gettelfinger was doing everything he could to stave off bankruptcy at Ford and GM. And I mean, this whole process going from this delegate process to direct elections, the delegate process was always something that ensured a level of stability within union leadership. And you didn't have these kind of political swings from administration to administration within the UAW. So this seems like it's a big change in tone and direction.
Yep. Yeah, you can really, in the language that Shawn Fain has been using in his campaign, and now that he's president, it's really sort of a take no prisoners kind of language, and stirring up the troops. We're gearing, we'll strike. It's more confrontational. So that, is something that the automakers are definitely looking at, and they have a lot of resources, so they're looking at the possibility of a strike, and how long they think the union could endure a strike and how long they think they can. So those calculations are happening right now. so yeah, there was the language that is different. It's less collaborative. Uh, Definitely, we're gonna fight, and they really Members United campaign on a platform, where they came out and said, um, we don't want any more corruption. We don't want any more tiers in employment. That's TIER. They, because there's two tiers of employees and some get paid less. And we want cost of living raises. They came out and said that. And we want, better pensions. And those are cost of living raises are a big issue because, they haven't, they, auto workers tend to, in the US anyway, versus Canada, they tend to get lump sum payments at the end of the years rather than a cost of living raise written into their contracts. So the lump sum is more uncertain. So they're coming out and saying they want to fight for those things, which the automakers have said, like with the pensions, especially, that they do not want. They do not want to make concessions there.
Right. I mean, the past few contracts have been more, the worker compensation was tied more to the company performance. We saw some really generous profit sharing over the following the Great Recession, moving into those great automotive profit years, that 6 or 7 year period we had with that 17 million new car sales when GM and Ford and Stellantis were really very, very profitable. Those individual workers benefited from those profit sharing checks, but it was bonuses. It was not statutory pay is going to be reliably higher. It was as long as GM was really profitable in North America, we were going to benefit. So it's a different set of concerns.
Exactly.
So transitioning a little over to let's talk to you, Garrett. You've been covering a lot of what's been going on with some of these startup electric vehicle companies, and there's been a lot of shakeup there. Can you talk a little bit about some of the players and what's happened recently?
Sure. So yeah, it's analogous in some ways to the ICE auto industry from a century or more ago. That there are a lot of people looking to stake their claim to what's going to be a big market, and one way to frame our thinking on this has been continuously that there will be a shakeout. There was always going to be a shakeout, that not everybody can succeed. And really, since about a year ago, maybe at the middle of last year at the latest, you could start to see some people emerging, whether they had, like Rivian, a lot more cash on hand as they look to build the production capacity of their R1 platform, or whether it's companies that have been able to scale up already. Obviously, Tesla is the outlier here in the conversation, but you have a firm like Lucid Group as well that's been making cars at a decent number. Right, we're still not talking about hundreds of thousands of cars, but Lucid produced or delivered 4,500 cars last month, and wants to get to 10 to 14,000 this year. That puts it in the conversation with some of the larger players. By comparison, Ford sold about 10,000 EVs in the first quarter. So in terms of scale, you're starting to see that some of these smaller companies are making their mark. And, while it's difficult for them to ramp, it's difficult for anybody to ramp. You can see that with GM and Ford and Stellantis as well. Some of these smaller ones are starting to make their mark a little bit, while others are really struggling to even just get product out the door consistently. And that's where you're seeing the difference. And there's really a gap widening between the Rivians and the Lucids, and then maybe a company like Arrival that wanted to make electric buses and delivery vans, has had to pull those production plans back, is now just focusing on a delivery van for the North American market, and has pushed the timeline back for the production of that. You also have Canoo, you've got the model up there, that is getting a little more traction. It's kind of in between the two groups that I just outlined. They have a lot of orders on the books, that $2.8 billion they recently said worth of orders. They're targeting to have 20,000 units shipped this year. So that's a decent number. that they have a lot of work to do to get to that 20,000 run rate by the end of the year. But you can see that the ones that have gained traction are separating themselves from the ones that keep having to kind of push out some things. Just this morning, ironically, Faraday Future, that wants to make kind of these higher end sports types cars primarily, said that a timeline for some of their deliveries of some of their first cars that even about 5 weeks ago, so they said was going to be the end of this month. This morning they said, actually, it's the end of next month because some of our suppliers couldn't come through with what they had promised us. And that's kind of one of the themes that we've seen with these startups, is that they, as much as the Fords and the GMs of the world are having to wrestle with their supply chains, and that includes also on the truck side, Daimler Truck, the large organizations are having to wrestle with it, but there's an infrastructure there, there's a track record there that allows them to do that a little more efficiently than a startup might have to. There's not much of a history there, right?
There's buying power.
There's buying power.
You're writing bigger checks.
Exactly. And Rivian CEO RJ Scaringe talked about that repeatedly last year and early this year, that they were struggling with their supply chain because suppliers themselves constrained were delivering based on previous allocations. Well, Rivian didn't have any previous allocations, so it was at the back of the line every time that the suppliers only had so much product to ship. They basically got the last little, scraps, which then kind of worked through their ability or hampered their ability to scale up. So the same problems that the big automakers and the OEMs are facing, the suppliers are facing in much greater kind of venom that they have to deal with, and that includes capital, right? The Ford is investing $1 billion here and $3 billion there, and GM has that much kind of money as well. The startups used to have access to the capital markets when things were great, but when those markets kind of started closing up a year ago, they're really struggling to find new investors, and that's going to be another big hurdle that they're going to have to clear. Do they even have the cash? Because they're not generating much cash, if at all. Do they have the cash on hand to follow through on the plans that they've made? So it'll be a trend that we're watching here, and that I would expect really starts to produce real winners and real losers here. I would imagine in the next 6 months, that by the end of the year for sure, we'll know that there's a chance that this company is going to be able to keep doing what it wants to, and there's very little chance that this other company will be able to kind of follow through on its plans.
Yeah, I think of a company like Lordstown Motors. They a couple of years ago, they launched the SPAC, the Special Purpose Acquisition Corporation. They generated a lot of money through an IPO. They bought the plant from General Motors to start producing vehicles. Never really got production going. Had to sell the plant to Honghai, the Foxconn parent company. They're trying to use that plant now, but they burned through probably about $3.5–4 billion in a couple of years, to now maybe getting a contract built truck out sometime this year, and not in the numbers they originally expected. So it's a tough thing to do to launch a new product at this scale.
Yeah, and these companies were always going to be, the startups were always going to be racing against the clock, right? Because they knew that the incumbents would have a harder time really getting rolling, but once they got rolling, that cloud of dust behind them was going to catch up to them in a pretty quick way. And so there was always a time element to their plans, and we may be in that window now where time runs out for a few of them.
Yeah, we can't talk about electric vehicles without mentioning the elephant in the room, which is Tesla, because as much as there's been this big increase, General Motors sold around 19,000, just under 20,000 electric vehicles in the first quarter. Tesla sold around 250,000.
Yeah.
So, the difference between number one, number two, and number three is so radical in the electric vehicle space. There are some signs that, Tesla's gone from 99% market share to 95% market share because they have competition now from the incumbents and some of these startups, but they are still dominating this. Kind of bringing Laura back in, it raises a question. Tesla is now they're producing in California at a plant that was once a GM Toyota union represented joint venture, and they're also producing in Austin at a greenfield plant they built a couple of years ago. Is the UAW targeting groups like them? Is there a chance to go after Tesla? Is there a chance to go after some of these startups?
I think, well, the UAW has tried some organizing efforts at Tesla and hasn't had much success. I think it's the jury's still out with this new leadership where they're going to, plan their union drives. There is like the factor that union, just union popularity in the United States has gone up. There's more support for unionizing, even though they're like union membership is not actually going up, but like it's really jumped as far as the number of people in the U.S. who are supporting unions. So there's a better climate, but the UAW has not historically had any success. Maybe just a few. There are a few wins, a few small wins in the South, but they have had failure after failure in the South as far as organizing auto plants. So they're going to have to decide where they want to spend their money. And maybe it's going to be like in other sectors, not necessarily auto workers. Maybe there's some suppliers that they may look at, organizing. So, I don't see Tesla plants being unionized anytime soon.
Well, you mentioned the environment for this, and that gives me a perfect opportunity to plug. We have a webinar taking place in just about an hour and a half at 2:00 this afternoon, which is an editorial webinar. This is something we've arranged internally. This is not a sponsored event. This is strictly to provide information to our audience about labor relations and changes at the national level. We have the Biden administration really creating some much more worker-friendly policies, and that's been showing up at the National Labor Relations Board. It's been showing up at the Federal Trade Commission, and we're going to talk about that at great length this afternoon. So if you have not registered for that, please head to the IndustryWeek website. We have the webinars tab. It should be a really fascinating conversation later this afternoon. But along those lines, Tesla was just cited the other day for anti-union activity by the NLRB. So that whether or not there's support within the California factory, there is some support at least to the organizers there to get better access to make their pitch to their fellow workers.
Right.
Is that's what's been holding things back? That there have been many attempts over the years during Democratic presidencies to organize in Ohio and Indiana for Honda, or Kentucky for Toyota, and none of those have really generated any success for the UAW. So
yeah, and there are reasons for that. I mean, part of the reason is just the money that's spent in the South to have these plants located there. Republican governors, the last thing they want is unionization. So, they are actively working with the automakers there to, fight any sort of union drive. And also, some of the wages at the plants are, they're not as high as union wages for sure, but in some towns, like in Canton, Mississippi, or in Kentucky, where Toyota's located, the wages are much higher than the going rate. So that disincentivizes unionization. Maybe that's why we haven't seen much movement.
Well, it's going to be an interesting rest of the year between watching what happens during contract talks this summer and watching which of these electric vehicle companies is able to hit its targets, and we'll be keeping an eye on that. Thank you so much to Gear DeLomard and Laura Putre for joining me this afternoon. We will be back in 2 weeks for another Production Pulse. If you have any suggestions on topics you'd like us to discuss, please go ahead and email me. My information's all up on the website. And thanks for your time. And again, if you have some time this afternoon, want to hear more about changes at the federal level that are really favoring workers over employers right now, we have a great webinar scheduled for that.
I'm looking forward to that one.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.